guess to start, could you introduce yourself? Just tell everyone your name, maybe like whatever title you would like to use, and maybe just something you want to share, personal, fun fact.
Sure. My name is Liora Dudar. I'm an Ursinus grad 2010. I worked at the Berman, got a degree in fine art photography, and went on to co-found oVertone Haircare about 4 years later.
Did you exhibit your work at the museum when you were here?
I did. I mean, being an art major, it was like part of the requirements, right? So I did 2 shows at the Berman, and in my senior show, 2 of my photographs were acquired. And I think they were the first photographs in the museum's permanent collection.
Do you want to talk a little bit about like what your photography looked like when you were a student, or?
Yeah, for sure. I think I did some of my best work at Ursinus, honestly. And I was so fortunate that Don Camp was the photography professor at the time. And we got, I would like to think that we got pretty close. And he was an absolutely incredible mentor to me. And his point to me was always that, pretty art is pretty art, but like what makes it art is meaning. The ducks on a pond analogy is something that I actually use like on a very regular basis in my business. Like, is what you're making nice or is what you're making meaningful? And so I was at Ursinus. I was actually kind of frustrated because he would never teach me like conventional studio lighting setups or get me into anything that I thought was like part of a photography degree. But what he was giving me was an art degree, and I really appreciate that. So while I was at Ursinus, especially my senior years, when I got into the flow of developing my work, I sort of had a digital component, which is the glitter stuff that you've seen. And I had a pinhole photography element, which I have all of the pieces of because I love them so much. But I started in a pinhole photography class where I sort of, or maybe it was just part of what we were doing. I honestly don't even remember, but I ended up folding my negative paper, so what you would put inside the pinhole camera, which was a paint can, into origami shapes and then exposing into the shapes, because the idea that my camera was a paint can and it has a curved shape, so the images would always end up looking a little fisheyed. So I was like, well, if I change the shape of my paper into different encapsulating forms, how does that continue to like manipulate the insides? So I started catching light essentially in all these different shapes as much as I could bend the paper into, and they sort of created these worlds. And at the same time, I got really into the photography of a woman named Marilyn Minter, who does these sort of like grotesque fashion portraits. Like, they're so beautiful and erotic, but they're kind of disgusting. And she was working with glitter, and I became really obsessed with the shot. So a very old friend of mine gave me essentially a bag of glitter that she wasn't using for herself anymore, and I started dumping it on people in huge quantities and sort of getting really close with it. And what eventually evolved was a dynamic between the 2 projects where it's like I was creating these other worlds, and then I was creating what was inside the other worlds, sort of in this parody. So I displayed them together in my senior project. So that's what I worked on. So this is an example of the pinhole negative.
Oh, I love
that I would take. So I would actually peel off the back of photographic paper to make it thinner. So I could fold it. And then this is an example of print.
Oh my gosh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, so I was lucky because the first one I ever made was really successful. And every single one after that was not. And it would take so much more effort to actually create something useful. But I tried a lot of different things with it. But yeah, so you can see here, this is the negative, and it's a cup shape.
Yeah. Wow.
And so this is the negative, and this was the first one I ever made.
Oh my gosh, that's a very fascinating process.
It was exhausting, but it worked really well, and I look forward to doing it again one day.
So when you were a student, when did you work at the Berman? Like from what year to what year?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was just my senior year.
Okay.
And one of the ways that I got involved was I was working on an independent study with 2 of the art professors and a handful of other art majors, and we were doing an exhibition on censorship called Behind the Curtain, I think is what it was called. So I was working really closely with them and sort of got introduced to the Berman that way, and then started at the desk and helping Julie in the back room.
Oh, nice. So you worked with Julie. I did too when I was a student. Do you remember like what your sort of day-to-day role was, maybe besides desk work?
It was mostly desk work, but occasionally, because I think I had sort of like a later relationship with the museum, I think, than a lot of the other folks that worked there, which made sense. I was a writing fellow also, so that was where I put a lot of my time, as far as like on-campus work. But when I wasn't at the desk, I remember Julie had me helping in unloading and loading, so like really sort of nailing in the proper way to pack a crate and, things of that nature. But that was mostly, honestly, what I did when I was there.
After Ursinus, like after you graduated, what was you touched on this a little bit, but what was your career trajectory?
Yeah, so it was 2010, so not a lot of opportunity for an art major, and I'm currently married to my high school sweetheart, who at the time was living in Tucson, Arizona. So we were going to be together no matter what. So given the economic recession and the fact that he had like a stable career as an engineer, I went to Tucson, Arizona. But one of the probably most interesting positions that I held before quitting my day job to pursue photography full-time in activism, which eventually gave way into oVertone about 9 months after I quit my last job, was I worked at Tucson houses the University of Arizona, which has the Center for Creative Photography, which is a foundation started by Ansel Adams, and is like one of the largest houses of photographic archival work in the country. And I remember being at Ursinus doing work for some of my classes and looking into all these like photographic reference books and seeing that so many of them were actually at, like, so many of the photos I was looking at were actually housed at the Center for Creative Photography. So I got work there as a scanner, and I basically was part of the effort in digitizing the entire collection. And probably my most exciting moment doing that was I got to scan an Edward Weston negative, one of the shells, and I like nearly had a heart attack and like could not breathe and needed supervision to handle the negative. But yeah, so after that, at the same time, actually, I was doing photography on the side and trying to sort of find my footing in the community. And I did a handful of activist projects, which sort of directly correlated to my experience with both behind the curtain and the issues of censorship and living in a red state for the first time in Arizona. And also the sort of like pieces from Dawn around like, don't make art without meaning. And I started the Feminist Photos, which is now on display in Berlin. I have a piece there, and also it's on display at Hotel Zena in Washington, D.C., which is a series of phrases written on women's bodies. And from there, collaborated closely with other local feminists on bigger and bigger projects until I sort of met my co-founder and wanted to work on something a little bit different and bigger, and something that was a little more economically practical. And we founded oVertone, which is a beauty company that has always maintained enough a value of intersectional feminism as we've gone on. So, we've never photoshopped our models. We're trying to stay as like close as we can to those values and use our platforms in an activist and ally position.
Wow, that's amazing. I love how art sort of brought you two together to like found it. I always see ads for oVertone on Instagram.
I was like, you look like someone that we target. That seems legit.
But I love seeing the photography for.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely don't do it anymore. I did it for the first like 2.5 years, or about 6.5 now, but we've got an extremely talented photographer on staff named Seth, and he just has a way with still lifes that I will never master. And he's so excellent, but it frees me up to sort of spend more time on passion projects and stuff that I enjoy working on. And
I'm wondering, like, if the Berman Museum like had a big role or like even a minor role in your life after college, or like how things unfolded, or just like working in a museum experience with one as a student.
Oh, I graduated and was seeking work in museums and galleries. It was what I really wanted to do. When I was at Ursinus, I was also a Kemper Scholar, and a lot of the opportunities that I got from that program was a internship at the Chicago History Museum, and also an internship at a gallery in Chicago, and sort of coming full circle with that experience with working with the Berman and sort of having the opportunity to be like hectically trying to map pieces in the space for the show, or like afterward sort of the experience of the interaction of like trying to figure out how to hang things on walls or what that looked like, or putting together the or helping to sort of curate and put together the behind the curtain show sort of pushed me to understand the importance of context. And creating that the way that you frame things and the objects you place next to them like is a subjective point, and having sort of like that purpose in your communication is paramount. So like it's not random that you put two things together. It's like they communicate to each other no matter what you do. If they're next to each other or how far apart they are, also communicate something. So sort of that practice and like dedicated education and sort of understanding how that comes together, I think. And also understanding that like beneath an ordered world, there is always monumental chaos.
Yes, absolutely. Do you see a connection between museum work and what you're doing at oVertone now?
I think sort of teaching object like respect, or like harkening back to sort of like different moments, and again like that placement of context and organization, I think is really important. I would say more sort of my relationship with art as founded through museums and my experience with the Berman and the creation of that show, and the time that I just spent in that sort of quietness and understanding like how the temple of a museum can render the objects almost like emotionless for people, and how sort of like the breaking down of something into something more relatable and accessible without it being like perfect or protected sort of by this like very austere servicing, like can help people relate to the objects more. Sort of, actually maybe more accurately, I remember my husband's an aerospace engineer, and we like would go to museums and he'd be like, I don't understand how any of this comes together, and sort of explaining from a curatorial perspective how you can move through like a painting's meaning in relationship to like the others around it, and like the point of view and the argument, as like you were saying, and sort of bringing that like not everybody thinks through the world in sort of like with this critical eye, and like what can we bring from a critical eye perspective to what we put out with oVertone, especially as it relates to like our intersectional feminist work. How do we present this in a way that's like, what's our argument that we're making with it? Because so often this could skew toward like oppression slinging, like here's everything I've lived through and therefore, as opposed to like we could choose to bring an argument of like joy to it. Like, yes, there's like oppression, and how do we talk about like our joy of the experience of embracing other cultures and embracing what's different from ourselves. So I suppose in the long form, curating around to that perspective.
Could you talk a little more about like what you do at oVertone day to day, like management position?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot. At first it was everything, and now it is less of everything. Over the last 6.5 years, we've assembled a crew of about 75, 80 people. And I run a lot more in like an operational context. So I help make sure that there's like progressive policy and emotional and psychological safety, that we're sort of not relying on people to teach themselves how to do things that they've never done, but providing an environment that's like coaching focused. And especially now, we've actually just recently hired a CEO. So I can step back a little bit from that purely operations role, and I can step back into more of the creative side of the business, which I really enjoy. So sort of being really thoughtful about tone and feedback and aesthetic, and like where we want to end up, and trying to be on that cutting edge, and like really leaning into that feedback perspective of like, okay, here's what the team's produced, and how do we give them the best constructive feedback to go back, or how do we set up the brief to work in a particular way. As the business has grown, it's been as much of a learning experience as anything, because it's the biggest company I've ever worked at. So I have literally no idea sometimes like what people are doing when they want to create systems or process or bring on a project manager. I'm like, I have no idea what any of that means, so I'm going to learn about it. But my day-to-day is very much like, are the ships running on time? Where are we going in the future? What does that look like? How do we want to get there? And then how do we sort of like continue to incorporate these values as we move forward. And what does that look like at scale? Like when we were younger, it looked like this. And now that we have this platform and we have these avenues and we have these resources, what should it look like? And what do we want to see it like in the industry? So how do we lead from that perspective? And we just launched our campaign called Intersections of Beauty this month, which will help sort of become our annual program around inclusivity and providing platforms throughout the year for different groups. So I'm excited about that.
Go for it. Is there a color of hair, like a product that you like the most? Or
I started out on the warm side of the spectrum and I've since moved to the cool side. I've been growing out my roots in quarantine, so I've got all of my brown hair up front. But I've been on like the blues and greens for myself. But as far as like a favorite child color, I don't know. I've always been really, really color focused, as you might be able to tell from the images that you've seen of mine. And sort of like really just delighting in the expression and the history of color, I think is just awesome. Oh, like we didn't have a word for blue for so long.
Oh, yes.
And then like all of a sudden we can come up with these words, or like what do colors mean in different cultures, or like how do we embrace them, or what do we talk about? One of the things that I've always really insisted on with oVertone is that one of our most common questions is like, what color will look good on me? Or at least it was at the beginning. And I'm like, I don't know. Like, there's no color that looks good on you. Like, I'm not going to tell you, I don't want to emphasize that you can be restricted to a range of colors. It's really about like, what colors do you like close to your face? What color shirts do you wear all the time? What's your favorite color shirt? That should probably be your hair color, like whatever you want. It's a playground. I mean, I might not be blue forever. Like my business partner was hot pink for many years, and right now she's blonde. And it's like we move through different parts of our lives. Like our colors mean different things to us, and like how we use them to express ourselves or enter a room or exist in space. Like it was so hard at some points in the last year to like even think about maintaining my color because I felt drained, and so every part of like my body exhibited that, and sort of re-engaging with color for me as far as like hair color is concerned, and really making like an effort to have that be a part of like my life and my aesthetic is like a physical re-engagement with the world in a way that like maybe in quarantine hasn't been so accessible. And I think in other ways lots of people have been reaching into this time to try and play with that like self-discovery of like, well, who am I and how will I, to use to stick with the museum terms, like how will I curate my existence in the world, and what do I want to tell people about me before they see me? What argument am I entering the room? And it's like so many people have been playing with hair color for the first time because it's the first time they really felt permission. They felt like in a safe space where they can actually like engage, where they won't be judged. Or I think the thing I hear the most is like, you're so brave for having colorful hair. And I'm like, the only thing that's brave is that it's expression. It's like the most out there difference. It doesn't grow out of my head this color, so I'm doing something different. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of been funny to see people's reactions. My mother, when I first did it, the first time I ever colored my hair, my mother had like a heart attack. She's like, oh my God, like how could you root, like this is awful. And then I will never actually see her now without color in her hair. There are actually certain colors that I won't send her of oVertone because I know that they'll stay in her shower and she'll get mad at me. So like I send it to her and I'm like, you can only use this outside. Like I'm not like gonna hear about your grout for the next 3 years. But she's always using it. And same for a lot of women in my family who until very recently have had like a more conservative sort of approach to their wardrobe or to the way that they interact with the world, not from a political or verbal stance, but from like a physical orientation or self-expression through beauty and makeup and hair. And suddenly they're sort of like gripping onto this, like, whether it's through support of me, which I love and appreciate, or whether they're sort of like engaging with the material for the first time. It's sort of fun to see them take control of what they can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Has the pandemic really affected, I'm sure it's really affected your day-to-day operations at work? It's totally changed my role at the Berman, so.
I can't even imagine. Are you there now? It sort of looks like you might be.
Yeah, I'm in the building, but it is completely empty. The Wi-Fi, it's better here than it is at home. I was doing like small curating projects, and now I'm like leading digital content creation for the museum. It's been like quite the 180.
Oh man, yeah. So about I mean, almost a year ago now, we did we were sort of watching at the beginning of the pandemic, waiting to see sort of what schools would do. And that was sort of our indication as to how we wanted to change. We're like, what are other, we don't know really where we want to land on this. And then, the 14 days to flatten the curve came around and we said, okay, guys, we're shutting down. Take whatever you think you're going to need. Don't leave anything to spoil in the fridge. We're transitioning overnight. And we went really from an almost completely in-person culture across all three of our buildings in 2 states to as much of a digital oriented culture as we could. And because we were still doing our own manufacturing at the time, and for a short period of time that will continue to be the case, we had a building full of folks that had to go into a building to complete work. And I agonized over that decision and what we were going to do to provide as much safety and security as possible in a world where we really didn't know anything about how the disease was going to be transferred between people or what the stats were or what it was going to look like. So I took advice from other colleagues. We supplied as much as we could. We were really, really strict around our shutdowns. So like if there was a chance of exposure, everybody left for 2 weeks until we got either a negative test or 2 weeks had passed and then people would come back. So we've been really, really stringent. And then as far as our creative is concerned, like we launched new products at the end of April last year that we needed to provide content for. And like my videographer was like filming in her basement. She did an incredible job, but I was like, we can't sustain this. So over time, we sort of opened the office back up to 1 or 2 creatives at a time just to give them access to, spaces that they need in order to perform their work. But we are continuing to wait on stronger vaccination and sort of like the time when we can reorient our offices to give more space between people, because I understand that like most work can be done digitally and there's certainly benefits to work from home, but I very strongly maintain that there's an economic disparity and a privilege in being able to have a positive work from home relationship as opposed to one that's more stressful. And I think that providing an environment for people like an office is really critical in terms of like generating equity of experience. And I think it's my responsibility to provide that as much as I can as safely as I can. And right now, I don't believe that we can create a safe environment by having the office open, so we don't have it open.
Yeah.
But as far as like, I've always enjoyed working from home, but like I definitely, like when I was a full-time photographer, like I didn't see people for days sometimes. And like, I know what kind of stir craziness that can create. And I think some of my employees are just experiencing that for the first time, and it's a real struggle for them. But we do what we can to stay connected and to stay engaged with each other and create as much psychological safety and connection as we can in sort of a digital environment. And I don't think we'll ever go back completely to the way that it was because the world is different. Mm-hmm. But it's still really important to me to provide those spaces where people will be able to gain access to a place that's separate from their home environment, create like strong work-life balance. Because the other thing work from home does is it convinces you that you can be a work machine because you can't ever, if you're unpracticed at it or you're undisciplined about it, you don't put it down.
Yep.
And I don't want that for any of my team. So I really I'm looking forward to that return, but like we basically, people were experimenting with their hair colors so intensely over especially the first couple of months of quarantine that we had to adapt really quickly, not only going to completely remote, but also in terms of like increasing our supply chain very, very rapidly to meet the demand. And it's been an exercise in growth in a lot of ways. But, for all the stress it's caused, I'm just so thankful and grateful that my team was as committed to working through the turbulence of the moment and staying connected, because it's made all the difference.
Yeah, well, I really admire how much you're, thinking about the well-being of everyone. Like it is so hard to live through this. So.
It's the number one thing that keeps me up at night. And like a lot of my employees have been talking about, on a weekly basis, we get together and talk. And I've been hearing from a bunch of them that like pandemic blues are really sneaking up, and I just try to remind them like we are all collectively coming up on the 1-year anniversary of an extremely traumatic event. And that is going to cause us all pain, and it's normal that you feel this way, and we're going to work through it. And the same thing with the Capitol riots. Like check-ins and, sort of all of the traumatic events throughout the last 12 months. How can we move through this holding patience and grace for each other, understanding that like we are all at our wits' end, but if we're all going to row the boat in the same direction, we're all on the same team, and we just have to agree on that direction, and it's going to be forward.
Well, I'm wondering if you have any like advice for like young creative professionals. Anything you want to impart?
I think this is also an Ursinus throwback. I was so lucky my freshman year. Colette Trout was my freshman year advisor and stayed my minor advisor. And she is just such an exceptional woman. And I remember this conversation we had because we sat down and like, my mother's side is like family of immigrants. And, when my mother went to school, her father wrote her a very famous letter that said, "You are in school to learn a trade. Stop fucking around." And sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse. But so when I went to school, I also took that seriously. And I was like, okay, well, maybe I should go into psychology, or maybe I should go into business, or, something that will help me in the future. And Professor Trout sat me down and she looked at me and she's like, "Do you know how many business majors there are?" And I'm like, "A lot, probably because it's practical." And she's like, "Do you know?" And she's like, "What classes do you want to take?" And I was like, honestly, like only the art classes are appealing to me. And she was like, "Do you know how well you could do with like a focused creative mindset?" She's like, "Be an art major." And, while I had to beg and negotiate with my parents in order to make it happen, I was really fortunate that they supported me on that. And at the end of the day, joining that up with being a Kemper Scholar helped me understand that it's not the major you have, because you can really learn any skill set to be dangerous enough. So being a business major, I think, wouldn't have helped me. But coming at the world from the perspective of both a liberal arts student, somebody who, was able to generate experience across a variety of subjects, with a focus in art, which engaged my empathy and critical thinking, I was able to take that approach to everything that I do. And I like to joke, like, yeah, I'm a fine art major and I'm running a company. Like, if you thought your degree was useless, but I mean, in reality, it served me extraordinarily well. Not only from the perspective of like thinking there critically with my business partner, going like, well, how do you mix red if it's a primary color? Like, how do we solve that thought problem? And engaging the color wheel and being like, okay, well, like, what are we gonna do here? To, how do you give feedback to any person? Because that's a skill that you learn in art classes. Like, you have to give active feedback to the person that they can act on in order to improve. That's like a huge part of the group critical thinking moments that you learn. As well as engaging in like, what's the meaning of what I'm doing? You never have to walk through life wondering, well, why am I doing what I'm doing? Yeah. And sometimes it's make ducks on a pond, and other times it's because the work that you do is important to you in some capacity. And I've always tried to take that with oVertone. oVertone is a great way for me to make money and survive, and to have like occupation and to do it and to do something that I enjoy. But in every other sense, it's an opportunity to bring meaning to my life and to bring security and meaning to the people who work for me. And I try and do that as often as I can. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So, if I were to give one piece of advice, it's, pursuing your passions is not necessarily a waste of time. It's how you leverage the skill sets and objectives and perspectives that you learn from your passions into other things that can bring you, can help you level out your Maslow's. That's really important there.
Can you share what the details of the duck pond metaphor? Can I get the full thing?
Yeah, I mean, Dawn will obviously have feelings about how I'm telling it wrong, but I will tell it how I remember, which is, we would sit in his office, which was in the bottom of Science Building, the dark room is, and it was, a window closed space with the tack board, and every week I would show up he never gave me any assignments. I would just like show up with whatever work I had done that week. We'd post it on Tackboard, we'd sit back and look at it, and we'd talk about it, and we'd talk about why I would do things. And I remember the first time I brought him the glitter stuff, and he looked at it and he was like, "What's it about?" I'm like, I don't know, it's just pretty. And he's like, I don't think you're really going there. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, it's like ducks on a pond. I'm like, what do you mean it's like ducks on a pond? He's like, a photo of ducks on a pond is very nice to look at, but there's not a lot there. It's just ducks on a pond. And I'm like, okay. And then one day I noticed, I looked up at his tack board and there was a photograph of ducks on a pond. And I was like, what's this about? And he was like, that was sent to me by one of my students because her grandmother looked out her kitchen window and said, oh, what pretty ducks on a pond, and took the picture. And you know, she sent it to me. I'm like, so what does it mean to you? And he's like, well, sometimes it really can just be ducks on a pond. It meant something to her. It was a moment of her life. It was like this piece of expression. So it for me, the ducks on a pond metaphor is really about the meaning that you give something.
Yeah.
So it has to sort of like come authentically from the moment, right? Like the woman wasn't just like, you know what's pretty, ducks on a pond, and I'm gonna find a pond, you know, and I'm gonna like make this photograph that's just ducks on a pond. It was like she was spurred to action by this moment that struck her as like a part of her life, and therefore it had meaning and beauty. Like art is the subject of your full attention. So when I started working with the glitter stuff and started experimenting with it, he kept telling me that I wasn't really going there and I was holding back. And I was like, I don't feel like I'm holding back. I'm literally just like dumping glitter on people. Like, what is it meaning that I'm holding back? But when I really started to explore the transformation that people would undergo during the process of applying glitter to them. And I mean, this is like me shooting in my bedroom in, you know, the top floor of Musser, getting glitter all over the carpet, you know, having random friends and acquaintances and people who suddenly got interested in the project show up to my dorm room, and like I would have them get half naked, I would dump glitter on them, and then I would be very close to them taking these macro shots and like sort of developing this comfort, and I would just sort of watch them go from being one creature to another. They would sort of like take on this like powerful or alternative persona, and it was really about capturing the nuances of this transformation at a macro level. Then it became about the beauty or sort of erotic nature of a naked body with glitter on it. So it sort of changed meaning, and once I sort of started leaning in and pursuing that, the work became much more interesting.
Thank you so much for this. It has been enlightening and fascinating. You're a great person to talk to.
Very touched and very tickled to both know that I was thought of, and also that like my work is up somewhere on campus. I just figured it was somewhere in the archive, but like, yeah, that's so cool. All right, Teddy, it's good to meet you.
It was great to meet you as well. Thank you so much.
Of course. We'll see you.
Bye.